Did mass protests just change the course of Israeli history? Earlier this week, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced that his government would delay voting on proposed judicial reforms that have sent the country into a tailspin. In the 3 months since Netanyahu's government announced the upcoming reforms, Israel has been convulsing with protests. Why? Well, the reforms are, as the kids say, kind of a big deal. Do the kids say that anymore? I don't think they don't say that anymore, right? Anyway, broadly speaking, the proposed reforms would change 3 major components of the Israeli judiciary. And you're going to hear me say pro-reform and anti-reform so that you get clarity on all of this. So the first is the override clause. Currently, the Israeli Supreme Court has the power to strike down any law it finds to be, quote, unconstitutional, even though Israel doesn't actually have a constitution, which is why I did air quotes. This reform would give the Knesset the power to override any Supreme Court decision if at least 61 out of the Knesset's 120 members voted to. Anti-overhaul protesters contend that this renders the High Court toothless, but proponents of the judicial reforms claim that this is the only way to put a check on the power of the Supreme Court. Number 2, reasonability. The way it works right now, the Israeli Supreme Court makes decisions based on reasonability. Proponents of the reforms claim that reasonability is a vague metric that gives the courts an unreasonable amount of power. See what I did there? Especially since there's no law or rubric governing what is or isn't reasonable. But protesters say that the reasonability clause, which applies only to administrative law and can't be used to counter legislation, provides the public with essential protections from laws governed solely by political interests. That's basically just a fancy way of saying that if the government is doing something corrupt or problematic, the reasonability clause protects citizens. And number 3, the reforms would change how Supreme Court judges are appointed. Right now, a 9-person committee chooses each judge. Who's on the committee? 3 Supreme Court judges, 2 Israel Bar Association representatives, and 4 ministers and Knesset members. The reforms would replace the Bar Association representatives with public representatives chosen by the Justice Minister. Anti-reform protesters say this gives the government way too much power to choose the court, but advocates of the reform point out that the people have no say in the appointment of their judges. Okay, so that's the basic breakdown. Now you could say you understand what the issues are. But what makes this week's protest different from all other protests? Yeah, Passover's coming up. I'm ready. Are you? Well, on Sunday, Netanyahu's Defense Minister Galant publicly urged the Prime Minister to press pause on the reforms.
כשר הביטחון של מדינת ישראל, אני אומר בצורה הברורה ביותר. השסע ההולך ונפער בחברה, חודר אל תוך צה"ל ואל גופי הביטחון. זו סכנה ברורה, מיידית ומוחשית לביטחון המדינה. לדבר הזה לא אתן את ידי.
In response, Netanyahu apparently fired him. Hold on though. Why would a minister from Netanyahu's own party publicly challenge his boss like that? Well, Galant was getting pretty worried about the proposed reforms' impact on the Army. Last week, hundreds of Army reservists, including 200 Air Force pilots, declared they simply would not show up to their posts if the government continued to push for reform. That's a serious threat in a country that depends on its citizen army for its survival. And you know, making sure the country survives is kind of the defense minister's whole job. Some members of Netanyahu's government applauded Galant's firing, chief among them Itamar Ben-Gvir, the controversial Minister of National Security. But tens of thousands of Israelis felt otherwise, taking to the streets in fervent and spontaneous protests. And this time, major institutions joined in. The country's largest labor union called for a general strike. Embassies shuttered. Israel's consul general in New York resigned. The airport grounded all outgoing flights. Universities and malls, hospitals and ports all shut down. Netanyahu spent hours huddling with his cabinet on Monday. Finally, he emerged. And in a public address, he agreed to delay the vote so as to avoid a rift within the people.
תוך הרצון למנוע את הקרע בעם, החלטתי להשהות בהי את הקריאה השנייה והשלישית של החוק במושב הזה של הכנסת, כדי לתת זמן לנסות להגיע לאותה הסכמה רחבה לקראת החקיקה במהלך הכנסת הבאה.
Anti-overhaul protesters cheered, but the rift is far from over. In the wake of Netanyahu's announcement, counter-protesters have started taking to the streets in support of the reforms and more broadly of Netanyahu's right-wing government. See, the fight over these reforms isn't just about the power of the Supreme Court, and I think people are starting to really realize that. This is a fight about Israel's character, its values, its very soul. Because most, though not all, of the counter-protesters fall into at least one of these three categories, and let's not just paint people with a wide brush, but here's a general understanding of it. They're religious Jews, more typically speaking. They're generally right-wing, either living in the West Bank or supporting the existence and expansion of Jewish communities in the West Bank, or they're part of the 50% of Israelis with recent family roots in the Arab or Muslim world. And they feel, this is really important, they feel that the Supreme Court, which again tends to be secular, left-leaning, and Ashkenazi, does not and has never represented them. Many in the pro-reform camp claim that the protests are the left's way of stealing the election. Netanyahu ascended to the prime ministership for the sixth time in December of 2022 after a particularly difficult period in Israeli politics. But the coalition he put together had many Israelis, not to mention diaspora Jews, flinching, because this coalition is widely agreed to be the most hardline in Israel's history. Pro-government protesters say that this is precisely the problem, that the country's left wing is out of step with the mainstream Israeli public, that these protests strangle the government's ability to do its job and amount to a soft coup. Meanwhile, anti-reform protesters point out that the opposition to the overhaul has united people from across the political spectrum. This isn't a right versus left problem, they say, it's a democracy problem. Here's what I think. I think this moment is going to make it into the textbooks. But I think the way we tell the story matters. My parents are psychologists, so I've spent a lot of time thinking about, well, psychology. And one of the most interesting questions for me is how families build resilience. I promise this is relevant to Israeli democracy. See, researchers have found that the most resilient families, the most resilient people, tell themselves realistic stories. What does that even mean? I'll tell you. There are three types of stories you can tell about your history. The first is an ascending narrative. This is your average started from the bottom, now we're here kind of vibe. You know, grandma and grandpa left the old country where all they did was starve and run from pogroms, and now we're here and everything is perfect. See, it's ascending. And then the flip side is the descending narrative. That's your riches to rags bummer stories. You know, our trouble started when grandma and grandpa left the old country, where they were wealthy and respected, just to become penniless immigrants in an unfriendly country. The third and the healthiest way to think about your past is through what's called an oscillating narrative. Shout out to Bruce Feiler for this idea. That's a narrative that acknowledges complexity, that says, hey, sometimes things are good, sometimes things are not. Progress isn't linear or exponential. Circumstances ebb and flow. We've handled the bad and we can do it again. Unsurprisingly, it's the third kind of narrative that builds resilient families. Families who can make it through the tough times together because they have before and they know how. Families who hold on to hope. What exactly does that have to do with the Jewish state? Well, the Jewish state is a big family. And whether Israel gets through this depends on the story Israel tells itself. And I think that the story of Israel is an oscillating narrative. Sometimes it's been great, the 6-Day War, for example, a triumph. And sometimes Israel's doing less great, like the First Lebanon War, for example. But Israel holds on to its capacity for hope. And Israel weathers the storm because it's been there before. Which brings me back to this moment. I think Netanyahu did the right thing in delaying, and here's why. Israeli society is overwhelmingly diverse. Different religious beliefs, different ethnic backgrounds, different political opinions. But all the way back in 1944, future Prime Minister Menachem Begin coined a slogan that has characterized Israeli politics. Milchemet achim le'olam lo. There will never be a civil war. Anything is worth a compromise if it averts a war between brothers, which is the literal translation of the Hebrew phrase for civil war. The motto has been sorely tested 5 times over the past 75 years. The Altalena affair in June of 1948, the German reparations episode in 1952, the disengagements from Yamit in 1982 and Gush Katif in 2005, and of course, the controversial Oslo Accords that led to the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995. We've put some links in the show notes if you want to learn more about all of this stuff. And now we may have reached another inflection point. It's all part of the oscillating narrative. This isn't a fun time in Israel's history, but what stories will we tell about it? And how will we use what we've learned from the past to overcome this crisis? How do you turn this crisis into an opportunity? I hope we tiptoe back from the brink, that cooler heads prevail, that this delay leads to negotiation, conversation, compromise, maybe even a constitution, and that Israeli democracy emerges stronger than ever before. Wishing everyone who celebrates a happy Passover. This is the holiday of storytelling. Let's tell our stories. Happy Passover.